I'm seeing it. Are you guys? Now we're recording. Okay, so I'll ask the usual question. Does everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I just thought I'd give a little bit, I'd kick it off with what the heck calibration files are. So let's see if I can do full screen here. Does that, you guys still seeing everything kosher?
Yeah, good.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So what are calibration files? And there are different types of defects or characteristics that we need to remove from our images. Characteristics, I would say, are physical characteristics of the telescope, dust bunnies, things you can see and hold and touch, versus electronic characteristics, which is more amp glow and electronic noise, things like that, that exist in the camera chip. So physical defects we take care of with flats. And I'll show you my little setup in a little bit for doing that. And electronic defects we take care of with biases, darks, and or dark flats or flat darks. I don't think we've decided what they're called yet. Half the people call them flat darks and half the people call them dark flats, but it's the same thing. It's they're dark frames that you calibrate your flats with, right? And for those of you that know more than me, which is almost everybody, just correct me if I'm saying something wrong. So several ways to create flats. I just use a flat panel. If you have a remote operation like some people do, you can just point your scope at your flat panel at the end of the session and take your flats, or whenever you want to. Some brave people like Craig, I think, do sky flats, and I'm too lazy for that. It's because you can get, your timing has to be just right. You have to be fast at it. You can get stars in your images, and that's just too much of an effort for me. I'd like the easy way. Any problem that can be fixed, by automation, I'm very happy to do that. So this is my setup. So that's my scope pointed at my flat panel. And basically what you're shooting for is your flats should be about 40 or 50% of the maximum ADU, maximum amount of brightness that or maximum amount of shades of gray, I guess, that your camera can handle. So if you have a 16-bit camera there, you can see I have 65,536. That's 2 to the 16th power for 16 bits. 14-bit camera would be 2 to the 14th. Either way, you're aiming for about 40 to 50% of the maximum value, which is, on my camera, 65,536. So I aim for about 30,000. And I say it doesn't have to be exact. It's 30%, 35%, 40%. It's kind of you look at it and you can tell if it's right. And unfortunately, with this hobby, a lot of this stuff is, it when you see it, So there are 2 ways to get to that value. You can vary the brightness. So with my setup, I use Nina for my image capture, and Nina allows you to make your flats by. I have a USB controller for that flat panel. It's I think Greg said it's discontinued, isn't it, Greg? So that flat panel is discontinued, but you can just use a tracing panel from Amazon or something like that. Or some people just get a flat panel and put a t-shirt over there, try and get the right amount of light intensity. My setup, you can just vary, the USB, it has a USB controller. So my camera supposedly doesn't like short exposures. So I just say, just give me a 3-second exposure. Here's the ADU, and it varies the brightness on the flat panel to get me there. So that's how I create my flats. And I have a rule about flats: when they're ugly, they're beautiful. So this is a typical flat when I had a lot of dust and water spots and crap on my sensor. This is before I cleaned it last. And these spots that you see are from my master flat. And the master flat is used to calibrate your lights And so it will remove those defects. You can see the corners are also a little bit grayed out. That's vignetting. But the spots there will calibrate out the spots that you get in your images. So it pretties them up. I use PixInsight, which has this really nice flow diagram built in. And as my 7th grade algebra teacher said, and obviously it's been a long time since I was in 7th grade, but if you draw the picture, you'll get the picture. So here's a picture. So all the way on the left side here, we see the lights. You can ignore the filter and the time. And then it subtracts out the master dark. So, you know, any electronic noise, or you might have amp glow, which I'll show you an example of. I think Craig has some nice amp glow slides later. And then actually, when I looked at this, I'm like, why is that plus, that master flat? Because you want to, you know, it adds in those defects to the image to compensate for what's coming, you know, in your dust bunnies and your vignetting and whatnot.
Alan, I actually think that's a divide sign.
Is it?
Yes.
No, I think you're right.
Divide the flat into the lights.
You're right. Absolutely. Okay, good. That makes even more sense. Okay, and then you end up with a calibrated light. So that's the picture. Different types of electronic noise. DSLRs have thermal noise because they're mostly not cooled. And I think I think that's a little bit challenging, because especially at places like at CAC, where the temperature might drop 30 or 40 degrees over the course of the night. So people tend to have dark libraries. I have a dark library too. But I can usually control, because I have a cooled camera, I will just set the temperature. You know, in the wintertime, I can get away with the camera will cool down to 20 degrees, minus 20 degrees C. In the summertime, it's a little too much for the camera here. So I just do 0 degrees C, and I have darks that correspond. So I have a set of 0 degree darks for 60 seconds, 120 seconds, 180 seconds, 300 seconds, because you want your dark, the duration of your dark to match the duration of your light. Okay.
Hey, Alan.
Yes, sir.
Just FYI, I think you probably, I don't know if you've ever tried, but you can probably get away with minus 15 all year long. I do minus 15 all year long.
Really? Well, does it get up to 100 degrees in where you are?
It doesn't get to 100 degrees where I am, but it's not 100 degrees at night, is it?
Yeah. It'll be like 90 degrees. Yeah, 95.
Last night, go ahead.
Last night I was attempting to shoot, but I couldn't because of clouds. But I noticed when I set mine to minus 10 here in Vail, I was getting maybe a maximum of minus 8. So,
okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just me, but I think the ZWO cameras, the cooler is less than optimal. How's that for a polite way to say it? Because they claim it'll get to minus 35, but it won't. So in the summertime, you know, I could probably do minus 10. I don't think I could do minus 15. So I just do 0 degrees and call it good. That way my camera's not going at 100%, you know, cooling effort. It's going at 50 or 60%, so it's more manageable. So I have here, you know, all imaging systems require flats because you want to characterize, as I've heard Doug Summers say, your imaging system. So, you know, if you have dust bunnies, or if you have vignetting, dark corners on your sensor, you know, if you have a cat, you know, a Schmidt cast, maybe you have a central obstruction, and the calibration files will pull that stuff out. So that will make your lights look pretty. So here I'm just going to mention darks to calibrate out electronic characteristic. The most common, probably not anymore, because my sensor doesn't have any amp glow. On the 2600, I think Paul just said he got one. So there's no amp glow, which is really nice. And here's a beautiful picture of what amp glow looks like. So as you can see on the right side there, you would see that in every one of your lights, and you need to remove that. I think Doug has a 183 camera, which has a pretty good amount of amp glow, and Doug has done a great job creating darks to calibrate that stuff out. Some people say you should shoot calibration frames every single time you image. I tend to not do that unless I notice any major changes. I keep my optical assembly, my camera attached to my scope at all times, just so I don't have to do that. And I've been shooting with the same set of calibration frames for a year now, and they've been working just fine. So with that, I'll hand it off to Craig. I think that's the end of my stuff. So Craig, you want to take it from here?
Sure.
Can we make a comment real quick before we go to Craig?
Yeah.
So I think we should be precise about the calibration frames. The darks, unless something changes with your with your camera proper, since it's completely covered when you take the dark, you could use that over and over and over. I think I've been using the same darks for almost 3 years. The issue is the flats, and the problem is that if you change your camera rotation, right, every time you change or take the camera on or off, you have to do the flats, because you're never going to get the rotation exactly in the same spot. So there's a subtlety there.
Yeah, that's true. However, I have heard that some people will shoot darks like every 6 months just because the sensor is aging. I don't know if you've not ever changed it. Some people don't use darks at all. If you don't have amp glow, some people just won't use darks, period, and they don't have any complaints about it. So that's kind of your mileage.
Like you said, that 183 has a lot of amp glow, and I've been using the same darks for quite some time. So I think really the darks here are in pretty good shape. If you deal with the temperature, you have to do it for different temperatures. But if you've got the same temperature, you can keep that dark for until you think the camera's breaking down. So.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it. Like I said, I've seen some people that shoot darks every 6 months, and some people don't even bother with them.
Right.
They shoot them once and they never change them like you were doing.
Yeah.
I use PixInsight for my integration, for my image processing, and in PixInsight you have to match the, I won't say have to, but you're supposed to match the temperature at which you've shot the darks to the temperature at which you've shot your lights. Or
do the adjustment, right? They've got an adjustment flag there for you, right?
Yeah, they've got an adjustment flag there. I've never had good success with it. If anybody else
I've never
has,
tried it. It's just easier to take the flats at the same temperature. Right?
Yeah.
A few comments about this. Another thing that flats are good for is removing hot and cold pixels. And
right.
That's one thing. And if you're shooting with a CMOS camera, you very often don't even need bias frames. They have such a low noise level for that.
So, Alex, I'm wondering, would you say the same thing if you're doing cosmetic correction? Because it seems like cosmetic correction is killing off your hot and cold pixels anyway. Right. So does it matter?
It depends when you do it. If you do cosmetic correction after the calibration, that's okay. If you do it before, you'll overcorrect with a dark master that already has those hot and cold pixels in it. I've done that. And so, yeah, you want to do any cosmetic correction as the last thing. And if you use WPBB, WBPP in PixInsight to do your calibrations, that's when it does that, it does the cosmetic last.
Right.
Well, and I have a question about, you brought up, Alex, bias frames, but with the CMOS cameras, I keep hearing that you should never do bias frames. And I know with my 294, I would never want to, because of the amp glow and even though it's a small duration flat frame, amp glow shows up in it. So it needs to kind of get calibrated out of the flat too. And a bias wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I use a 2600 mono, and I don't use bias at all.
Yeah, I use bias on everything, all of the CCD, and seldom, if ever, on CMOS. Okay. And that's just kind of what I read in literature I saw.
I have some examples that we'll get to later.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Do I have to do something to stop sharing? Yeah, stop share. There we go.
I think you're good, and I think I am trying to figure out which one it really wants to take here. I have a dual screen monitor, so I'm not sure which one I'm
There you
showing.
go. We see it.
All right. I got some of the same stuff. I'll try to skip where I can, but a little bit of my equipment, and Doug, this will drive you crazy because the one scope, one set of equipment mantra is definitely not here. So I've got both the 2600 and the 294 camera. I do all my capturing with the ASIR Plus, so flat frames, darks, dark flats, you know, the lights, that all happens. And then I've got a wide range, you know, the telescopes are really meant to get a wide range of focal lengths. So I've got the Hyperstar, really fast 390 millimeter. Then on the other end of that, for galaxies, I put the reducer on it. And, you know, I found that I really need to, with these two cameras, I've now broken it up into using the 294 for anything kind of 800 millimeters and above in focal length, and the 2600 for everything under that. One of my more recent additions was this 230 at the bottom, and I'm almost finding that the 2600 pixel size is too big for it. But I've got a variety of different setups here, and this just gets at what I was talking about, where I use the cameras on which focal lengths. You get the sense of, you know, the 294 again being on the longer focal lengths. So the tale of two cameras, really, Alan kind of mentioned it. He's got the 2600, no amp glow. I always do darks because I'm hoping that darks will help identify hot pixels, cold pixels a little bit better. I also do cosmetic corrections, so I'm not, you know, I think I'm okay there. But with the 294, oh my God, that thing's got all kinds of amp glow. Supposedly, it has problems. I used to do flats that were under 2 seconds, and everybody that knows a lot more about the 294 than me says you got to do even more than 2 seconds. You got to do 3 or 4 second flats to help stabilize the flat that it's taking an image of. It's just got some image capture issues at less than say 2 seconds. So I used to use a light panel when I was doing 1 second or less flats, when I was using the automatic mode, and I was getting weird flats, and I don't know if it was because of the light panel. Maybe my light panel doesn't have a really good illumination. It's one somebody else had recommended to me, but that's when I went to sky flats, and I have not had any issue with sky flats. I always use a thin white layer over it, so I don't have to worry about getting stars. But I do them, ideally I do them at dusk, but a lot of time that doesn't happen because I'm setting up after dusk, and it just doesn't happen. But with this camera, I've got to do dark flats because of the amp glow that's even present in, you know, 3, 4, 5 second images. So this is the 294. This shows you, you know, it's got amp glow in a couple areas. This is probably either a 180 second dark or a 300 second dark. I don't remember. You can even see it a little bit on the bottom right. On the left side, there's some amp glow. It's horrible. Now that compared to the 2600, this is the same, you know, duration. It shows nothing really. So I've decided because of that, and this is, Alan already kind of covered this, you know, the reason why this is the worst one I could find of my specs and stuff in a dark flat. But what I came up with is a common practice, because I got two different cameras that have two different, very different characteristics about them. I've come up with one process. I do 0 and -10 degrees for all of my lights, and then obviously my calibration frames. And I do almost everything at unity gain. There's rarely a time I will pick like 0 gain, but I've messed with that before, and I've messed with doing a high gain in the past, but almost everything's at unity gain. I always do just 25 frames. I don't know what other people are doing, but it seems to be kind of the sweet spot. You know, you get enough that you accomplish what you need to accomplish. And then, as I mentioned, I use one, depending on how bright it is outside. Sometimes I gotta, I'm a little bit late in the morning, and I gotta use more layers of a finely threaded t-shirt. So sometimes I need to put more layers on, but I'll start at, you know, if it's at dusk, I'll start at about 30 both of these cameras have the same maximum ADU. So I'll start at 30,000 about at the halfway point at dusk, and it'll end up at about 22,000. So it averages out at about 27,000 ADU. And just invert that if it's at dawn. I'll start at 22,000 and take my images, and it'll end at about 32,000 when I'm done with them. So what I've done is I've decided that all of my flats are gonna, I'm not gonna have to worry about flats at different lengths. I do dark flats at 2 and 3 seconds. I think I got 4 seconds now. And at the, you know, unity gain at 0 and -10. And then my lights, I find where I can get them at either 2 or 3 seconds. I time it, I wait until, you know, I hit that ADU level at either 2 or 3 seconds, and then I start taking my flats. So I don't have to worry about doing additional dark flats to match up with them. And then I've gone down, because of the Hyperstar, I've gone all the way down on darks to 10 seconds, because there's some objects that, you know, I need to take very short exposures of. I might get rid of that now, but I've gone all the way down to 10 seconds for the cameras, and that's the library I put together and store. If I decide to do something at a different number of seconds, then obviously, you know, it creates a chore the next day of getting my darks for it. I keep mine about a year. I just found, you know, I'm hearing what you're saying about you don't have to replace them, but I don't know, every once in a while I just get in a spot where I say, hey, it's time to get new ones. I just set them up and let them run for, you know, hours, and then collect them. I usually don't process those raw frames right away. So I wait until, so I use AstroPixel Processor or PixInsight. I've gone to almost using PixInsight solely now, but I'll wait until I need to use on any new frames I've done, any new flats or darks that I've done. I'll wait until I need them, and then I'll create the master as part of the process of running whatever it is through. And then I'll just use that master on a go-forward basis. So really a summary, I do everything at 0 and -10 degrees. For the same reason, I think I don't want to have 3 or 4 different libraries. I don't go under -10 because of being able to, whether I'm doing it home where it might be a little bit warmer than down at the CAC center, -10 seems to work for a lot of things for me. And right now I'm doing 0. So it's a possibility I might set up tomorrow night and I'm going to run everything at 0 degrees because I know I won't be able to cool to -10 in my backyard. And then again, flat darks at 2 and 3 seconds. That matches up with my flats and then a library of darks. So that's really my process, and I'm open to any kind of criticism of it, things I should be doing different, but there you have it.
So let me come back just for one moment. I mean, if you think about how much of a pain in the butt it is to do calibration frames, people should ask themselves, is it worth it to keep my telescope optics clean so that if I do keep my camera on the telescope and I'm not rotating it, I won't have to take flats, right? I can just continue to use them over and over. And I kind of err on that side. I don't rotate my camera, I don't take it off the telescope, and I keep my optics clean so that I don't have to, I can just reuse those flats. You know, until I see an artifact on my images, I won't change my flats. And the same thing with the darks. I think if you actually took a set of darks and looked at them and aged them and compared them to the darks that you're taking now, okay, from last year or whatever, and actually compared them in PixInsight and did a diff against them, I'll bet you would see zero, right? You would see no difference. And so from that perspective, if you take care and you know what these files are for and what you're doing to cause you to need them, you could reverse engineer this work backwards and say, I'm going to do the stuff that's easier. I'll just clean my optics regularly. I won't move the cameras around very often, and then you don't have to do them. Just the thought for, food for thought.
Yeah, I tear my, like if I'm going to transport it, I tear it down a lot, and I don't really have a lot of room in the house to. Or put it a different way, I don't have a wife that would allow me a lot of room in the house to leave my telescope set up. So
I'm in the garage. That's that's where I live.
So I like the idea of leaving it like I have the 230 set up right now, and I've been using the same flats for like the last couple of weeks because I haven't torn it down, but frequently I tear it down. I also have on my OAG for the C8, I have a filter drawer. So if I decide to change filters, or if I'm down at CAC, I actually take the filter out. Then I'm a little bit more inclined to do a flat because I'm opening it up and I don't know what might have got inside. Because that one flat I have there, I don't know where all that stuff came from, all that dust. Because usually when I take my camera out, I cover it right away. And the only thing I can think of is maybe taking the filter drawer out, or just in that brief amount of time I had it out, that it was staticky and attracted a bunch of dust.
Yeah, when you're doing flats, I have two filters right now because I have the Hyperstar and the C8. So I have the filter drawers with the filters already in them, so I can quickly switch them out. But I have a light pollution filter. It's an Antlia tri-band RGB Ultra. And then I have the IDAS NBZ UHS. So I always thought that if you're going to do flats, you have to use the same filter for that set of flats. So I typically will do flats, unless I take the imaging. If I don't take the imaging train apart when I'm shooting at home, or I don't change the filter, I'll just leave everything the same. Otherwise, if I have to change the filter drawer out, then I'll probably do flats if I need to.
I have a question, but it's in a different direction. I've heard a couple of you refer to the fact that you don't want to have your camera running at 100% cooling. What is the negative side to that? Why not?
Well, one reason is that I read an article recently that once you get to about 90%, you'll probably end up at 100%, and you might start to lose temperature because the core of the camera, the body of the camera starts to heat up. So now the ambient almost around the camera is hotter. But there's a tendency, when you first start it, you're at a 90% plus, that you'll probably end up at 100% and maybe not be able to keep it cooled to whatever temperature you're aimed for.
Well, I shoot at -10 most of the time, although during the summer, I can see going to 0. But is there really a negative effect? Is the camera getting hot because you're trying to cool it?
Yes.
Well, and also if you're running 100%, you don't have any headroom. You don't have, as mentioned, you want to, if for some reason the load increases, you need more cooling capacity, and you're already at 100%, then you're out of luck.
Yeah, and then your sensor will just warm up instead.
Thank you.
Right. If you'll share yours there, Craig.
I think you have to, oh, stop share. Okay, got it.
All right. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sure.
All
Yes.
right.
Yes.
So I'm going to take you on a little history trip because most of what I'm doing is dinosaur compared to what you guys are doing. But I think it'll be instructive. And you probably don't recognize this cartoon diagram, but it's from the book by Richard Berry and Burnell, A Handbook of Astro Image Processing. And unfortunately, it's a Wilman Bell book, and they went out of business. And this isn't one of the ones that's been resurrected. But if you can get your hands on a copy of it, it has all the math behind everything that we do, including even some of the newer cameras. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'd use with a remote system with a CCD. And although it's a little different from what you've heard already in terms of CMOS cameras, I think a lot of it should make sense based on what you've already heard. So this is my equipment. It's a Newtonian astrograph, an f3.75, 906 millimeter focal length. And I'm using a STL 11000M camera, which is 16 years old. And I purchased it back in 2007. It's been running pretty much flawlessly with a few hiccups since then. It's a full frame CCD with 9 micron pixels. And as you see in the image there, I'm using a Spica flat panel for flats, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, but you can see that the scope is pointing at the flat panel there. You may notice in the background, one of my observatory mates' telescopes got the same setup. He's got his scope pointed at his flat panel as well. And so for data acquisition, I'm still using Maxim DL, and I still use it to calibrate images. So as you already heard, the advantages of a permanent setup or semi-permanent, if you don't remove the camera from the scope, is that the calibration frames can be used over and over again. And in fact, you can even take those frames when it's not practical to take other frames like light frames. So in the remote operation, on the nights when it's cloudy or there's a full moon or the target's not in the right position, it's always a good time to take calibration frames. But again, as you've heard before, if you have a library of calibration frames and you don't take the camera off of the scope, then those calibration frames can be used pretty much indefinitely. I typically shoot dark frames every 6 months or so, simply because the CCD ages, and you'll see an example of that here in just a second. So with this camera, I have to take bias frames. And again, in case you're not familiar, bias frame is just a 0 duration frame at whatever temperature and binning you intend to use to calibrate. So this is an example of a -20C full frame bias frame, actually 30 frames median combined. And what you can see there is a 17-year-old chip with a lot of partially bad columns. Now, this has been stretched to show you all that nasty stuff. But again, depending on how you stretch the particular image, you won't see a lot of these. But I did want to point out that one of the problems with CCDs is that as they age, they get bad columns. Some of them have bad columns coming right out of the factory, but this one didn't. It had a couple, but there's a way around that, and I'll get to that in just a second. So again, the bias frame is simply what comes out of the chip at the temperature and binning with no exposure. And that's present in every image that you take, whether it's a CMOS or a CCD. There's a basic signal that's there. It may be very small, and in most CMOS cameras, the bias output is very small. The benefit of taking a bias frame is if you subtract the bias frame from the dark frame becomes a thermal frame, which can be scaled. So here's a dark frame from the same camera, same settings, 20 of these medium combined into a master frame. And you can see it's stretched a little bit differently, but there's still that one really nasty bad column that's there. And you can probably see a few other faint ones if you look carefully. And of course, there's a whole bunch of pixels that are there, even though this was a 5-minute integration. There's a lot of, and it was cooled to 20 degrees, minus 20 centigrade. There's still a lot of hot pixels there, which have to be removed from the light frame. And that's done by subtraction. But if you subtract a bias frame from this 300-second dark frame, what's left behind is what's referred to by Barry and Burnell as a thermal frame. And thermal frames can be scaled. And by scaling, what we mean is the dark signal accumulates with time. And for most sensors, it's fairly linear. So if you know the time and you get rid of the bias, you can scale frames as long as you have a dark frame, which is longer than the one you want to use. So for example, if I ended up taking a frame that was a light frame that was 120 seconds, I could use this dark frame to calibrate it by scaling it to 120 seconds. And that's done by subtracting the bias frame from the dark frame, so that all it's left to be scaled is the thermal noise. That makes sense? Okay, so again, there is a benefit to using bias frames because it does allow you to make dark frames or thermal frames, which can be scaled. And that becomes, it's not a terribly big thing to do because you can, of course, have a library of darks that are all matched to the light frames, and that's typically what I do. But it becomes very handy when you want to shoot flat darks. So this is the way that I shoot the flats remotely. The telescope is in the park position, and I have the flat panel set up so that it's always being pointed at when the scope's in the park position. So whenever I need to shoot flats, for whatever reason, it's a simple matter of just firing up the camera. Don't even have to turn the mount on. Fire up the camera, fire up the software, turn on the flat panel, and do the flat frames. And the way that's done on the left-hand side here is the software that comes with the Spike-A-Flat. And as I think we mentioned before, the Spike-A-Flat, the flat panel itself is no longer available, but apparently the company that made it still sells the software, and they still sell some devices to allow you to adjust your own flat panel. In any case, this is the software that they provide. And you can see on the far left, there are some presets. So you can remember what you used for flats the last time you made them. And then in the middle, there's a place to set the panel brightness, and it's adjustable from 0 up to 1,000. And for luminance, you don't need much in the way of this flat panel. And here you see I have it set on a setting of 2 out of 1,000 with an exposure duration of 1 second. So all you have to do is, if you pull up this preset, go to your camera control software, which you see on the right here, and set the duration for 1 second. Tell the camera that it's going to be a flat frame, so it puts that in the FITS header, and set the filter wheel for the appropriate filter. And then off you go and take your flats. And this works very well. It allows you to do the flats very quickly because the duration is only a second. And actually on this camera, it's an old USB 1 download. It actually takes about 35 seconds to download the full frame. So you spend most of the time downloading, but it's still rather quick to take the flats. So here's an example again from the same camera, full frame. This is a 1 second flat, minus 20 degrees centigrade. And I think this is 20 frames median combined. You see, of course, the dust bunnies, which tend to show up on the filter and the filter wheel. And you see a very faint central shadow there from the Newtonian secondary, along with vignetting around the edges. And you see the little histogram down at the bottom, which is very important because that's, again, how you determine the brightness setting for the flat panel and the duration for the exposure itself. As Craig and Alan both pointed out, you're shooting to get a ADU reading for a 16-bit exposure somewhere around 32,000 ADU. That's typically in the mid-range of the camera and well below the point where it becomes nonlinear. So having a library makes image processing pretty easy. And here you see the Maxim DL calibration library. And what you see over there is just a list of all the different files that are in the library. In this case, it's just looking at the dark files, and you can see there's a whole host of different durations, image sizes in terms of whether it's unbinned or binned, different temperatures. They all have a count of 1 because they're master images. And if you highlight one of them down at the bottom, it'll tell you all the detail about those. You'll notice also that at the bottom there's some group properties, and you can see the dark frame scaling says auto scale. Again, because there are bias frames in the dark library, that allows the software to automatically auto scale a dark as long as the dark is longer than the image you're trying to match it up to. At the very bottom, you'll notice that there's a little entry for bad pixel map. And you can have as many bad pixel maps as you want. I have a couple, one for full frame, one for 2x2 binning. But those bad pixel maps then go in, and after calibration has been performed, they get rid of those bad columns that you saw on the previous exposures up there. And as you might guess, on a CCD chip that's 17 years old, there's a lot of bad columns. There's probably 40 or 50 of them that I have to deal with. And there's more that occur every time. So I end up making new bad pixel maps whenever I see a column or a partial column appear in the light image that isn't already being corrected. Under the advanced calibration over here, you'll notice that there's dark subtracted flats and bias subtract flats. And that's again where the bias can be used with a flat in order to make it into a thermal frame so that you can subtract it from whatever the flat is, even though the flat exposure is much shorter. The final step for me is to actually calibrate the light frames, and that's done in Maxim the way you might expect. You load in the raw frames. You give it a directory where you want the calibrated frames to go, and then you tell it where the calibration frames are, and you check off perform calibration. And so what it does is it takes each frame in the list and it goes to the calibration library and it tries to find the best match for that. And in general, it does a pretty good job as long as I don't confuse it with calibration frames that have the same temperature and duration, and then it sometimes gets confused. But in general, it finds the correct bias, dark, and flat to match the individual calibration frames, as long as you've got the filter name in the FITS header someplace. And this does it pretty fast. For a full frame, for a full scale frame, 36 by 24 millimeter, it typically takes a little less than a second to do the calibration for each frame. The other thing that works fairly well for this is that Maxim DL can use subframes. And subframes are a little different than binning. In other words, if I take the full chip size and tell it that I just want to use the middle 50% of the chip because I don't have a big target and I just want to use that part of the chip, as long as that data is recorded in the FITS header, Maxim will go in and it will use the same segment of the calibration frames as has been used on the light frame, so that you don't have to have separate calibration frames if you're using a subframe of the entire chip. And that works very well. In fact, I usually don't shoot with the entire chip because of vignetting and other problems. And the size of the images are pretty large. So if I can get away with using the middle 50 or 75% of the chip, I use those, and the full frame calibration frames work just fine for me. So that's as far as I'm gonna go. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that may have brought up.
I have one comment. If I just was reading earlier, I won't say this week, sometime over the weekend, I guess, an article that I wasn't that interested in. It was about scaling your calibration, your dark frames using the biased, and it strongly recommended against it because the scaling apparently doesn't affect the bad pixels, particularly the hot pixels, in the same way it affects the rest of the image. And so those pixels apparently don't scale by the same amount as the rest of the image. And therefore, when the dark is applied to the light frame, it doesn't correct it adequately. And this was in relation to that, to PixInsight's tools, which allow you to scale things as well. It didn't say it was total disaster. It just says it was imperfect.
Yeah, it works. It works most of the time. There are sometimes when it doesn't work very well. And as I mentioned, it's mainly a benefit in that you can use the scaled darks for your flats, which are only a couple of seconds. So there isn't a lot of dark current to worry about there. And in the library, I typically have a 30-second dark, and you can scale that down to 1 or 2 seconds, and it tends to work fairly well. On an old CCD, like I've described to you here, even a good set of darks doesn't remove all of the hot pixels many times. And so I typically run a hot pixel filter over the images before I stack them. Yeah.
Yeah. One other thing. I noticed that, let me see, I made notes here. If you calibrate your dark with a flat, with a bias, let me get back to this. If you, calibrate your dark with a bias frame, then in the overall calibration later, you don't need to put the bias into the formula at all.
Right.
It's already in there.
Yep.
And sometimes that's a mistake people make, is try and push the bias through again.
Yeah, and like you saw on the 2600 chip that I think Craig showed, there's not much going on there in terms of bias. In fact, you don't really need to do the bias. And some of the older Sony chips, you didn't even need to use a dark because they were such low noise when you cooled them down to -20 or -25.
I have a question regarding the ASI Air that I use to do my flats and darks. No, it has an auto setting, and sometimes auto works and sometimes it doesn't. But in terms of the ADU, when I'm looking at the screen, when it's bringing up the image, I don't see ADU listed on that screen. Is there something that I'm missing, or is it labeled something differently?
I'm not.
It's my understanding that the ASI Air corrects for whatever screen you're using to shoot your flats. In other words, it will adjust the exposure to the amount of light that you're bringing through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm looking for the value, the ADU value that everyone talks about, and I can't see it on the ASI Air.
Yeah, I don't think you get it on the ASI Air. I think all you get is the exposure time.
Okay, got it.
Where are you looking for it? On the ASI Air, like if you're in preview mode, you take an image, it'll show you the ADU in the bottom. If you got the histogram open, it's the average.
Oh, the average. So it's the same thing then. Okay, that's what I was looking for.
Other questions? All right. Well, I have a few announcements. Our next meeting, July 17th, third Monday of the month. And again, this is our Monsoon Challenge meeting where you get to show us your best images of the two objects from the Monsoon Challenge. And in case you've forgotten about that, one of them is the globular cluster M92, well placed for early evening imaging. And the second is M27, the Dumbbell Nebula. Comes up a little later in the evening, but still good if you're out late. So either one or both of those are targets that we'll be happy to let you share at the next meeting. If you want, you can drop me an email and tell me you want to participate, and I'll make sure to have your name on the list, or you can just show up with your images and jump in whenever. And we're still looking for suggestions for future meetings. So if you have an idea about what you'd like to talk about at a future meeting, or especially if you'd like to be a presenter, please let me know or let Tom know so we can get that scheduled and figure out how to best get that presented. I'm always looking for images for the Desert Sky Bulletin. And a couple of things about that. I know some of you have told me, feel free to use any of my images. And so I do. But if you have images that you'd like to share, be sure to tell me about those. It's good.
I do. I have one of M101 with the supernova.
Okay. We're a little late for this month because we got all the supernova images already been sent in, but feel free to submit that. You need to send that to me, or you can post it on the TAA forum, and I'll be able to grab it there as long as I know that you're submitting it for publication in the Desert Sky Bulletin. The other thing to keep in mind is if you put your images on Astrobin, I can sometimes copy those images from Astrobin and send them along to the editor, but many times they're not available to be copied. So if you want your image to show up in the Desert Sky Bulletin, you probably, best idea is to send me a copy of it, 10 megabytes or less. A little more than 10 is okay, but we like to keep it small enough that we don't have to reduce it a whole lot before we put it in the bulletin. So again, if you post on Astrobin, that's fine. We'll put a link to your image in the bulletin, and any data that you want to share about how you took the image or anything special about it, that's great to put in there as well. But again, it works better if you send the image directly to me rather than me try to copy it from Astrobin. Any questions about that? Okay. Comments, suggestions?
Yeah, just one comment. The Bill Blanchard scripts that I've been, talking about as I process my images. It turns out now that those scripts are now a certified process in PixInsight, and they are going to be released in the future as a certified process.
Good to know.
Yeah.
What is that? What's going to be a certified? What do they mean by a certified process?
Well, it was Bill Blanchard's written these pixel math scripts for narrowband normalization for both OSC and mono cameras. So it provides the ability to create like a Hubble palette type thing or a show-like image. And he's been writing these scripts like crazy and making sure they're available to people. But in terms of PixInsight, it'll be like any other process, like GHS or anything else that might have started as a script, and now it's been certified by PixInsight. And I think in the future, Bill's not going to be writing the math anymore for those routines. That's something that PixInsight's going to handle.
Oh.
All right, good information.
Well, I've got a suggestion maybe for a future presentation. I've had to kind of learn by, I've been having to kind of bushwhack things with PixInsight. There are all those different tools, all those programs, and, knowing which one. Now, I've gotten some help from various people, including Doug, and I want to extend a thank you to Doug. I have some images that he showed me how to use photographic, what is that?
Color calibration, photometric.
Yeah, spectroscopic photometric calibration. And I have several images with that. I even like to show. I don't know if there's, well, if any of you would like to see a couple of them that I've done since.
It's a great tool.
Yeah, but I was thinking that because of that, I kind of got this down to a fairly simple workflow, and it works really well now. And I'm able to really get some images that are beyond anything else. And then with the addition of blur exterminator and noise exterminator, one thing that I noticed that whoever that gentleman is that wrote those, he put them out independently of PixInsight, but it has to be used with PixInsight, or else there's another one. There are a couple of other tools that he uses that they have to be used with Photoshop, and one of them was bias exterminator. I'm waiting for him to make it available for use with PixInsight, because sometimes I get a little bit of prominence with it, even though I've got an otherwise fantastic image of NGC 4725. I don't know if any of you have ever photographed. It's a fairly the core section of that galaxy is quite bright. It's a galaxy in Coma Berenices. It's a barred spiral inside. It's a big galaxy with a little galaxy inside, and the internal portion of it is a barred spiral, but then there's some outer arms that are kind of normal structured. I don't know, would any of you like to see the image of it? No?
Well, I'm sure you could post them on the TAA forum, and then everybody would get to see them.
Okay.
One of the things that my previous club in St. Louis used to do was to have a workshop a couple times a year. And since we had such a good meeting last month in May, where we actually got together face to face, I thought maybe one thing we could do this fall is again meet in some central location and have maybe a half day or 3/4 of a day workshop. And I think probably some of our PixInsight gurus could get together and do some hands-on, in-person demonstrations of some of the techniques that we've been talking about kind of indirectly, either via the forum or on these monthly meetings. So that's something that we'll probably be looking into for sometime this fall. So if you have any thoughts on that, please feel free to let me know what types of things you'd like to hear about. Obviously, PixInsight and PixInsight routines are ones that a lot of folks use. So I think that's kind of a good one to start with. But if there are other topics that you think would benefit from some sort of a half-day workshop, we'd be happy to entertain those as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Greg, if I could make a suggestion, I've only been working with PixInsight for less than a year and a half. And Doug was a tremendous help to me also. But one of the things I discovered was I basically put together process icons that create a working order for me to process images. And it might be interesting to have a program where people share their process, how they go from A to B to C to D. And in light of the comments about Russell Croman's additions and how much they have simplified processing and still improve the quality of processing, I think it would be fascinating to see how other people do process icons, what their steps are.
Yeah, I think that's where a hands-on workshop would, probably be a better way to do that. We could possibly do that for a monthly meeting as well, but because PixInsight is so complicated in terms of the number of available processes, it's difficult to nail down. We could probably nail down maybe just one, but typically because we have a wide range of skills, there tends to be a lot of questions.
Yeah. One suggestion for those of you who are just getting started in PixInsight, I came into this hobby knowing a lot about photography, but in terms of this astro imaging stuff, I knew 0.0. So I started out not knowing a whole lot. And the Adam Block PixInsight courses, the fast track training for $60, it wasn't much to spend. And I got the 45-day trial for PixInsight, and I spent the $60 on this course, and that got me off to a really good start. And then I upgraded it and put that money towards the fundamentals course. He is, if you want a quick way to get started and get a good foundation, I highly recommend his courses. And then the other question I have for the group is, does anybody here use Lightroom or Photoshop?
Yeah.
Lightroom, because what I found, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you get through the basic PixInsight processing, I found that just using some basic Lightroom adjustments or some Photoshop adjustments at the end really makes the image pop a little bit more. Not to the extent where you want to over process it, but just simple things like adjusting the highlights and the white and the black levels. I mean, simple things. If I try to do vibrance or texture, it can get over the top, but just the basic stuff I found in Lightroom really is a good way of finishing off the image. And even doing the levels or curves adjustment at the end in Photoshop makes a huge difference as well. So I'd be happy to share how I use those tools along with PixInsight sometime.
Capture One also has some additive qualities that are quite functional.
Oh, yeah.
And Affinity Photo.
Yep.
I use Topaz Studio.
All right.
Can I
think that is volunteering.
Can I ask a question of the group? In Photoshop, not in Photoshop, in PixInsight, there are the two color calibration things. There's a photometric and a spectrographic. If I'm correct, the spectrographic one uses the spectrum of the star to determine its type, therefore its temperature, and therefore its color. And if that's true, I would think that that would be a rarely used tool, since the stars may be obscured by our local nebula with something in front of it, such that the actual observed color we see from Earth is not its color it's radiating. Am I right that the spectrographic calibration is what it would look like if you were up close to that star, and not what it looks like from us, from our position?
It's a product of Gaia, a satellite that has been shooting the entire universe for a number of years. So it's not Earth-based. It's actually space-based.
Yeah, but I mean, it's using the spectra to determine this star's classification and therefore its color. Is that correct?
I know it's using the Gaia star catalogs, and you have to have the full set, whole library to get it to work properly. But when I was taking the course at Random Block back in January, this is the one that he was recommending to use. How it does it, I'm not sure.
Okay. We'll have to do more research.
Yeah, I know you need the Gaia SP catalog to get it to work properly.
Yeah. No, I've got it working. I just don't like the results it gives me sometimes.
I thought it was more of a comparison. It used the catalog to look at the stars in your image, compared it to the catalog, and then made adjustments for color. But I've never read up much on it. Doug, do you know how it works?
I think, I mean, again, it's an educated guess here, but I do believe that it's that the spectra information is known in the Gaia database, and so they are in fact using the colors, which equates to the temperature. All right, so they're getting the true spectra information, and then they're mapping that via plate solve on your image and doing a. You see the charts when they come up when they're done. They're doing a fit against all the stars that they could find that map into the Gaia database in your image, and then provide a best fit for the black or for the white balance. So I think it's not anything like the old color calibration where you would take a background sample and then you'd pick something that you thought was white in your image and you would do a calibrate against the white and the black. In this case, they're using stars from the Gaia database and mapping them to your plate solved image. And I think it's much better than the old calibration.
Yeah. Both the photometric and the spectrographic do that.
Right.
But they must do it in different ways.
All right. Good questions and good suggestions. We'll take those all into account as we plan for coming months. Thank you all for participating, and I'll stop the recording at this point.
Question. I have one last question. You're planning to do a workshop on this, and maybe would that be like on a Saturday or something?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
You were talking about doing a workshop on, like, say, PixInsight or this fall.
Yes.
Would that be like on a Saturday?
Yeah.
People could bring their computers in and maybe.
Yep.
That's kind of what I've been wanting all along, although I'm kind of doing a little better at it, but I know I'm sure some of my images could use some fine tuning. And I know there's one area that I still kind of need some help with, and that's getting rid of those background prominence, background colors. But I'm getting some good color balance. That SPCC has been fantastic. And I have much to thank Doug for helping me out when we were at CAC. It's a little tricky to get it up and running because you have to get that Gaia thing to work and apply.
We got it. You're set now. Greg, it may be that now with the new buildings out there at CAC, maybe in the fall, since lots of people like to go out to CAC, maybe CAC might be a place where a workshop could occur, right? Since there's a learning facility out there now.
And they'd have to let us in, right?
They have to let us in.
Yeah.
As long as you pay your dues.
That would be
All right.
ideal
That
on
might be an
one of the
idea.
new moon weekends.
Exactly. You know, if we do that while we're out there already, you know, we got nothing else to do during the daytime, so we could run
Right.
a workshop during the day.
Good suggestion.
Awesome idea.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next month for the Monsoon Challenge.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.